Great. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Just please note that the event is being recorded and the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. This year, our department is celebrating its 55th anniversary, and to commemorate that, we've established a new fund called the Economic Student Leadership Fund. As many of you know, one of the best things about the university experience is going to the Economic Student Society, joining case competitions, and networking with other alumni. This fund will go towards supporting student initiatives and creating transformative learning opportunities for them. A big thank you for those of you who've already contributed. We're continuing to raise money for this fund, so please do give your support if you can. If you'd like to get involved with our students, reach out to us. It could be volunteering your time, or it could be hiring a co-op student. And I stress, please hire co-op students. Just connect with us and we can chat more about it. Again, my name is Azam Badi. I forgot to introduce myself. I've had a chance to work in this department for the last 12 years. And I see a lot of names that I know here, and I welcome you. It's great to be able to connect. And I'm really appreciative of this community we have, our economics community that we're all a part of. And the most beautiful thing about this platform, we were just discussing this, is we were able to join together from all over the world and sort of really show our support for each other. The other unique bit about this platform or this community is we can speak to sort of econ related interests that we have, even though we have a whole variety of people here, minors, majors, MA students, PhD students, emeritus, professors. It's nice to be able to all sort of share one's experiences, and we certainly do have the goods here in terms of our speakers that are going to be able to do that with us. Without further ado, though, I would like to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Dr. Jane Polkingham, to start our events with a few welcoming words. Jane?
Thank you very much, Azam. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. And I want to congratulate you all, faculty, students, alumni, and staff of the Department of Economics on the occasion of the department's 55th anniversary. Economics, with its research-driven work on critical issues that affect society, its systematic yet humanistic study of the world, forms a crucial pillar of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and indeed the entire university. The department, originally the Department of Economics and Commerce, was established by SFU's Board of Governors in February 1964 and began offering courses within the Faculty of Arts, leading to BA, MA, and PhD degrees when the university opened in 1965. Since then, the economics department has adapted, grown, and flourished. Today, it's one of the top 3 economics departments in Canada and among the top 100 globally. The department's rankings are testimony to your collective outstanding achievements over the past 5 decades. In that time, the department has grown exponentially, both in teaching and in research capacity, as well as the depth of its influence globally through an impressive network of some 9,500 alumni. These alumni include high-level executives, economists, and academics, people with a wide range of expertise who've used their economics degrees to make real and lasting positive change in our society. And I thank you all for your dedication by coming together virtually to celebrate today the department. I'm excited to be here with you in launching a year-long series of events that celebrate the environment of excellence you have established over the past 55 years. And I look forward to the day, hopefully sooner rather than later, when I can welcome you back on campus in person and not just virtually. Thanks, Azam.
Thank you very much, Jane. I appreciate you coming by and giving us your welcoming words. Before I introduce our first speaker for the evening, I'd like to ask everyone to please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box during the presentations. We'll get to them during the Q&A portion of the evening after both of our speakers have presented. So on to our first speaker. I'm really pleased that Rogayeh Tabrizi was able to join us. She's an alumnus of our PhD program and is currently the co-founder and CEO of Theory+Practice, a data science firm that specializes in bringing advanced AI and machine learning solutions to her clients using insights for economics and tools from statistics and data science. In addition to her extensive technical background, she has over 10 years of experience working with financial, retail, and logistics companies to help utilize insights from the data and create a measurable path to data efficiency and subsequent exponential value. Wow, I was able to say that all without making a mistake. Rogayeh, I know well, and she's a great friend to our department. So Rogayeh, I pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Azam. It's really wonderful to be here. I see already a few faces of my advisors. So hi, Alex. It's really good to see you. And of course, some of the students. So it's actually quite humbling to be here and be among old friends, feels like. So let me share my screen, and I'm just going to jump into my presentation. So please let me know if you see my screen. You guys see this?
Yep, it's good.
All right, perfect. So what I thought to do tonight is talk a little bit about the state of industry, especially as it relates to AI and technological transformation. And then from there, talk about my own journey as an economist, kind of finding our way in this industry and the trends and interesting patterns that we are observing. So, oops. Okay, let's see if when I was thinking about three different aspects of the story, the researcher story, talent story, and the industry story, the thing that actually jumped up for me was the simple fact of AI research, unlike a lot of other research in academia, is actually very closed. Only about 15% of papers are publishing their code. And that to me is an interesting one. You know, we are observing a lot of very fast growth, models related to natural language processing, the NLP models. There's huge trends in that we are observing right now. Biology is exploding with AI. So, you know, they're experiencing their first AI moment. And I can give a lot of different examples of things that we are observing in finance, in retail, IoT, robotics, and it just goes on and on from there. The interesting thing about that is actually the talent story as it relates to the research story. So a whole bunch of different research institutions are actually being established, and they are very multidisciplinary to tackle AI and big data related questions. The funny thing, well, maybe not really funny, but the interesting thing is that there's an actual brain drain from academia to corporate world. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But right now, in terms of where majority of talent and people that are working in this field from, again, different disciplines, it's not just physics, computer science, it's also economics, it's data science fields are being established in different universities as well. But majority of that is actually, interestingly enough, coming from a few countries, and China being in top percentile of that. Most of these people end up, not surprisingly, at some of the top organizations and companies that we know, such as Google's, the Facebook's, Amazon's of the world, and also a lot of research and papers are being published from these institutions, as well as some of the universities. So the graph that you see on the right actually represents the number of papers that are being published and where those papers are coming from these days, especially in the field of AI. A little bit more on the brain drain. So between 2004 and 2018, a huge number of university professors and tenured or on a tenured track, they actually ended up leaving academia and joining industry. So these graphs basically show professors that have left these different universities completely, or at least have a double appointment with these different in these different organizations as well. And there is a lot of discussions around whether the trend is that actually a good thing, how that's impacting research, is that adding to our bias. And I think, well, like an economist would answer almost any question, it depends. I think it's very context dependent. I think there's a lot of good things about the cross pollination and collaboration between industry and universities, but also I can see the other side of it as well. in terms of the industry, again, a lot of advancement in biology, self-driving cars, computer vision. When it comes to NLP, you see huge advancements. And the graph that I have here, which I actually found it interesting myself, is this is in terms of the cloud providers. So if you think about where some of the net new signals are coming from, just looking at this plot of where the technology that supports a lot of these advancements are actually housed in, you kind of see where the world is actually moving towards. So, Amazon being really at the center of both providing a lot of business-related solutions and technology-related solutions, but also being a place that hosts majority of the data, followed by Microsoft, followed by Google, and it just kind of goes on from there. All right. In terms of enterprise, and some of the patterns that we are seeing in enterprise, actually a research just came out of MIT Sloan, and they had interviewed 3,000 different organizations. And the question was really around the benefit and the actual tangible ROI from investing in AI and these sort of like new technologies or predictive analytics, etc. And out of those 3,000, only 10% reported any kind of positive ROI or tangible ROI. So this slide shows a little bit more positive story, as in organizations and industries that have invested, they are reporting massive increases or in terms of their revenue, so their top line, but also their bottom line as well. So I think right now the state of the industry is very much a mix, and it depends on the frameworks. The frameworks and how AI and these sort of technologies are being used is really important. I'll talk about some of the gaps that we are seeing in a little bit, but again, at least I wanted to paint a little bit of a positive story of like some of the work that is coming out of academia, trickling into industry is actually creating positive impact and feedback. So from there, a little bit of predictions. There are a bunch of different trends that is observed, especially during 2019. I don't think anybody really saw COVID, so take this a little bit with a grain of salt. But in terms of things that are really interesting, again, investment into NLP. One of my mentors always told me, follow the money and see where the money is being invested. So investments in NLP, in autonomous driving, in security, cybersecurity, these are some of the trends that we are seeing, and it's actually backed by evidence of how much money is being invested in some of these industries. The part that is a little bit of a question mark is around quantum computing. I actually was talking recently with people from quantum computing at Google, and they were talking about how they are trying to really build on a lot of positive that they're doing, but the path is a question mark. How do we actually turn everything that is being done, especially the research, really incredible research that's being done, into something tangible? That's again a question mark. And in terms of governance of AI, ethics of AI, extremely important conversations, but are we actually settling on something? It's a little bit yes and a no. So from there, I want to jump a little bit more into some of the work that we are doing and why I truly believe being an economist has given us an edge, especially hanging out with a lot of physicists and computer scientists and people that are working in this field at the cutting edge of industry as well as research. One of the things I like talking about, and actually you'll be surprised how often people still ask me why I switched from physics to economics. The thing that I like to tell them is what I actually learned in either one of these disciplines. In a sense, in physics, I was exposed to a lot of, at least the kind of physics that I did, a lot of like big data problems. When you're working on a big experiment out of Geneva, when you're waking up to several terabytes of data every day, it is definitely a different reality. But the interesting thing about that switch to economics was about questions. Alex is here, so he's probably going to laugh at this. I would show up in his office, and I'm like, here's a model, but he would always ask me, well, what is the question? What is the intuition behind this? And in a sense, economics is one of the very, very few disciplines that actually trains us in the art of asking questions. At least I think there's a massive science to it, don't get me wrong, but there is actually a way of thinking about the problems and coming at it from different angles that I find it very unique, and it's not really largely practiced in different industries. So from there, and I think this was something that I was naturally doing at the start of the company, we just sit with people and they would tell me, hey, here's a use case, here's a problem, we want to tackle something. And I would be like, well, why is that the right question? Have we actually examined our assumptions? So I very much naturally was bringing the economic methodology into the picture while we were still working on figuring out how we can find solutions for these different problems. So one of the first things that happened, so if, a few words about theory and practice, we are, as Azam talked about, we are a data services company that focuses mostly on big data problems, but still very much, starting from a place of business questions and trying to understand what are the problems that we want to solve. In my everyday job, I sit in front of CIOs and CTOs, and they kept telling me about a lot of the different big data problems that they have. And in all honesty, I have a lot of empathy for them because at least in the last 3 years, I have seen a lot of horror stories. All the data in the world that you can ever wish for. However, the way to access that data, to actually work with it, extremely difficult. So, but the problem is that in the industry, most people actually start from this data universe that is filled with a lot of questions and a lot of obstacles. So what we end up doing is we kind of like an economist, we start with the questions. So, and that really takes me to actually a place of strategy. Being, I guess, a little bit of game theorist helps here. So, when I'm sitting with the CEOs and chief marketing officer, chief security officer, product officer, on and on, what is interesting for me is most of them have questions that they don't know how to actually translate to data. They kind of have the intuition, not exactly. There's a bunch of questions that, say, oh, we have to solve this and we have to do that. And if we understand our customer this particular way, this is gonna, we can actually solve a whole bunch of different things, but definitely the how-to is very much missing. People that are sitting in their data teams, they're analysts, mostly coming from either some sort of data science background. They can crunch numbers and they can come up with something, but still there is this big gap of, did you actually answer a right question in there? And how can you convince yourself that there is value in what you're doing? So one of the things that is happening for me on and on is that I constantly go back to this whole thing of like, how do you even choose the right question? Especially when you're, sitting in front of CEOs of multi-billion-dollar organizations. So, one of the things that I usually ask, I'm like, well, let's talk about the end. Who is the end user? Do we actually understand why they're doing what they're doing the way they're doing? And for some of you, you're probably smiling here because that's the definition of game theory. Game theory is a study of why people do what they do the way they do it, especially when they're embedded within several different frameworks, the constraints that they are dealing with. So at the end of the day, we are dealing always with constraint optimization. So do we actually understand the constraints? Those constraints are really hidden in the assumptions that people are making. So being able to address it from all of these different angles is really important. Then the other piece of it is, again, the scientific methodology. Can we test those assumptions? Can we verify it? Can we baseline it? Can we actually think about designing experiments that are going to help us understand the causality and not just be, lost in a land of correlation? Of course, I'm talking to a whole bunch of economists. So, we are, I think, a discipline that is just truly obsessed with it, which is so different from everybody else. I mean, I know I'm talking almost to your realities here because everybody relates with this, but when you are sitting with a lot of people from different backgrounds and industries, they just like shake their heads and they're like, but why is that important? Well, if you don't know the why and the drivers behind a particular outcome or a particular decision, how are you going to design anything actionable that is going to turn into a tangible ROI? Which now you see how, I think at least this is one of the reasons we see such a big gap between the algorithms and the stuff that are being built and embedded inside these different organizations and companies, but frankly, the lack of ROI that these organizations see. That to me is one of the big reasons behind it. So here, to give you guys an example, recently, actually during COVID, we ended up working on a really interesting problem. So the client is a big retailer. They are about $6 billion in terms of their revenues. They're all over US and Canada. And the question that they came to us with was, can we actually predict who is going to return what item before they even purchase it? Especially in the space of digital e-commerce. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody the impacts of COVID on retail here. So the return problem is really, really big problem. An average retailer, for example, sees more than 30% return. They deal with more than 30% return. So the short answer to that question, can we actually predict who's going to return what item before they did it? Yes, we can. There are actually models, they are coming from NLP space. You can actually borrow, they're called transformers. They're really interesting models that actually are designed to maximize the information you get from micro behaviors. And when I'm talking about micro behaviors, like literally think about a session, an online shopping session, that you're clicking on a bunch of things, you're adding stuff to your cart, you're searching for different words, maybe you're comparing different prices. So all of that information is recorded. So now the question is, can we actually extract the probability of return out of these different macro behaviors? So we built those models. We actually ended up building several different kind of models, and we ended up deploying two different versions, a live model and a batch model. But all of that, as interesting as it is still wasn't really the core. I remember sitting with their chief data officer, and I was like, okay, let's assume that actually we come up with this a score for you. What are you going to do with it? And then they were like, oh, we're going to give everybody who's going to return whatever they're going to return 10% discount and make it a final sale. So that way we're going to stop the return and we're going to save a whole bunch of cost. Like, okay, that kind of makes sense, but why 10% discount? Why not 5%? Well, we are building a very personalized algorithm. It says on individual level, item level, basket level, what you're going to do. So if I have that level of detailed information, why not personalize the intervention? And hey, I mean, I'm raising my hand. How many of us have done shopping and like, you know, put one extra item, one extra pair of shoe or whatever, just simply because we wanted to hit the free shipping threshold? Everybody does that. Well, so if we know that, maybe you don't have to give any discount. Maybe you just need to lower the free shipping threshold. But that's only possible if you actually understand the drivers behind what actually makes people return, and not just it's not just about probability of return. So I know I can't even convince them, because to them it's like, can you actually even do that? Can you actually even tell me why people are going to return? So there are models, actually a whole bunch of them comes from economics. There's a famous economist called Shapley. So the thing is, sure, you can build some of these neural nets. They are complicated, they're a black box, but there are ways of projecting the outcomes from them into a more lower dimensional space, if you wish. And then on top of that, apply, Shapley to give you the intensity of which one of the features that went into models is actually really making giving us a prediction that we are seeing. So, but the interesting thing was, I knew that we have to actually build them a value estimator that tells you for a given confusion matrix that comes out of your some of the machine learning algorithms. Here, we're really dealing with a classifier. So we have a nice confusion matrix. So based on the ratio of true positives and true negatives, we had to actually show them that if, for example, they give 10% discounts, they're going to lose money. We actually proved to them that they are going to lose about $1 million if they end up giving 10% discount to people who are going to return, just simply because it's a model and there are false positives in the model. So you have to take those sort of things into account. But anyway, the whole moral point behind this story is that it is just not enough to say, here's a solution and here's an algorithm. You really, and this to me is one of the things that economists can truly bring to the table, because frankly, a physicist is not trained this way. A computer scientist is not trained this way. But an economist can think about, okay, I observe a certain kind of behavior. There's probably reasons behind that behavior. How can I go to data to really extract those nuances? And then that way, build towards something that actually is going to create value. All right, let's see, what else do I have? The other piece behind that is actually, I think as economists, we also have a way of looking for net new signals. Whether these net new signals are outputs from our models, I kept talking with people, and they think it's just like such a novel language. They just don't know that it's extremely common among economists. I kept talking with people about, hey, micro signals and macro signals. You extract different information, you manage to combine them in a way that gives you a little bit more pointers toward bigger trends and patterns that you see, hence your macro signals. And then from there, you can actually take those signals and again, think about quote unquote interventions that you want to apply in a very particular way. So, but again, this way of looking at this field also comes from me being an economist more than a physicist. There's a whole bunch of things about methodology as well, but I think part of my own training has been around, let's think about what is the question, build something around that, test it, then move forward. And with that, really think about how we can actually enable the end user. So this feedback loop and the way, in a sense, I've combined some of the trainings that I've got in academia and now applying it to enterprise, I think is actually enabling us to really make incremental impact, but in a scalable way, much faster than a whole bunch of other people that would just, sit with these executives and would tell them, hey, you need 2 years, 3 years, 5 years in order to see anything. And you have to just change your entire data sets, stuff like that. Sometimes you joke with people, I'm like, it's not at all about boiling the ocean. It's about, give me the minimum viable data. I want to go to data targeted. But again, the thing is, the way how you go to data targeted is through understanding what is it that you're actually looking for. But it's not about the biases, it's not about data mining, but it's about being guided by the questions and being guided by models and intuition that help you explore different angles and different things. I think in terms of last words, one of the interesting things that I'm seeing missing, but I think truly matters, is the concept of, at least something that we talk about as intellectual diversity. This field of AI technology is not really diverse. And I'm not talking just about cultural diversity or gender diversity. I'm more talking about intellectual diversity. So, I really believe as economists and other social scientists, like there is a very real possibility to bring in different angles and perspectives that we have been trained with to the world of physicists and computer scientists that are building algorithms after algorithms. And frankly, if we don't do that, it's going to have unintended consequences. And we still see some of those unintended consequences anyways. I remember I was in New York last year, and I was sitting on a panel. It was about AI and bias. There were people from like industry leaders. There were head of AI for Capgemini. There were people from Data IQ. And the conversation was mostly around AI and bias. After listening to a whole bunch of people and questions, I literally ended up raising my hand. And I was like, here's the deal. I'm probably the only economist in a room of, I think there were about 200 people or something there. And I said, probably the only reason I'm part of this panel is actually because of my physics background, not necessarily even because I'm an economist. When I hear about all of these conversations about AI and bias, and I hear a lot of solutions that are about, oh, we can do this and we can do that, but I don't see anybody stopping and asking question of where that bias actually is coming from. When I think about bias, I think about assumptions, potentially untested assumptions. But if you want to test your assumptions, you need to actually be aware that you're making assumptions to begin with. And for that, you need to be able to ask questions. But if you haven't really been trained in asking questions, and your whole life you've been just like, let's just go build a model. Here's a question, but what is the solution to it? So there is a whole, I really look at it as almost a responsibility. There's a responsibility to just bring this way of thinking broadly to the industry. And that's the way it becomes, that's the only way that these solutions actually become testable and actually become actionable. And I already talked about going to data targeted and minimum viable data and the ROI from it. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much.
I really want to thank you, Rogayeh, for that terrific presentation. That was actually amazing. We have lots of room for questions in our chat box. So if you do have questions, please submit them, and I'll be able to present them to Rogayeh after Brian speaks. And so this brings us to Brian Krauth, who is currently serving as the acting department chair and has been a faculty member with SFU Economics since 1999. Brian, you've been around for a while. He completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His academic career has spanned several fields of applied microeconomics, including labor economics, the economics of education, and applied microeconometrics. So I'll leave it to you, Brian.
All right, thanks, Azam. Let me get share my screen and go into the right motion. Okay. My talk is, I'm going to call it the past, present, and future of work. So I'm sticking a few things in there. There's a reason for that. Let's see here. Academic economists, for the most part, are not very good at predicting the future. That's just not our thing. So you came here wanting to hear about the future. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the past and the present that's going to allow us to put into context the future. If you want to really know about the future, you talk to people like Rogayeh who are in industry, who are doing the work that is moving things forward. We are just watching. So what we can do is we can measure the past and present. We can know what's happened. We can know what's happening now. We can put these trends and some ideas about what the future holds in context. And we can maybe not make unconditional forecasts, but we can make conditional forecasts. If this happens, this will happen. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the past. So when we talk about technology and changes to the workplace and trade and policy, it's pretty common for economists to split up the last couple centuries of economic history into two sort of groups. One is the late 18th to the mid 20th centuries, where we see a lot of new technologies primarily related to production and transportation, the assembly line, machinery, industrialization, all these things. From an international perspective, it's a time of globalization in consumption. Things are made all over the world, and if you are a reasonably affluent person in a reasonably affluent country, you are consuming goods from all over the world. Since 1970 or so, and sometimes 1970 or so means 1945, sometimes it means 1980, sometimes it means 1960, where the real major technological progress has been in information and communications technology, ICT, and automation, which is sort of a variant of ICT. It's also been a period of great globalization, but unlike the previous first wave of globalization, the second wave of globalization has been one of globalization in production. So we see companies with a worldwide supply chain that are drawing parts from all over the world, having designs in one place and manufacturing half a world away. We're seeing a lot of outsourcing where work is done by another company or someone in another country. So we're seeing globalization in the actual production of goods and services, not just in where they're coming from. All right, so if we want to talk about how work is changing and will change, we want to think about a couple things. The most important one is, how will it change your compensation and your work environment? So will changes that are coming and that have happened, will they enhance your productivity in your existing job? That's the sort of best case scenario. If your productivity is enhanced and you keep your job, you're going to get paid more. Unfortunately, one possibility is that changes will make you unnecessary. So instead of enhancing your productivity, they enhance something else's productivity and replace you. These changes may have some other consequence, which is they may create a new job for you. And in terms of which of these three possibilities happens, a lot depends on the details and a lot depends on demand. So productivity enhancements can actually harm the people doing the work if they result in the work of 10 people being done by one, and 9 people lose their jobs. So for all the consequences of changes, policy is going to matter. And I'll show you a couple pictures that show you that some of the same trends that are operating all over the world operate very differently in some countries than in others. And the likely explanation for that is policy choices. All right, so I'm going to start briefly by talking about trade, only to dismiss it to some extent. And the reason is I want to talk about technology, and technology is really easy to describe. When we talk about trade, trade is more complicated. but there's a metaphor that we sometimes use in economics called the Saskatchewan car crop, if you've ever heard of it. And it says that trade is a technology. What do I mean by that? I mean that trade is a mechanism by which we take goods, we take inputs, raw materials, labor, whatever, and we convert them into something else that we value more. That's exactly how production works. We take a bunch of materials, we do something, we transfer them, we convert them into something we value more. And so when we talk about globalization, especially globalization of production, it's going to reinforce and be reinforced by some of these other technological trends. So the Saskatchewan car crop, if you've never seen the example, works like this. This is how you produce a car in Ontario, in a factory. This is how you produce a car in Saskatchewan. You produce a boatload of wheat, you load it into a hopper car, you send it east to Ontario or west to Vancouver, you wait a while, and that train that you loaded that wheat on comes back with a load of cars. So let's talk about technology. So in order to talk about technology, we want to think about tasks. So what do we actually do at work? And this relates to the question of what work in the future looks like. And a lot of work has been done in labor economics over the last 20 years or so about the task content of jobs. So all occupations and jobs require a mix of tasks be accomplished by the workers. We can classify these tasks in various ways. The most productive so far for labor economists has been distinguished between cognitive and manual tasks. So cognitive tasks are those one accomplishes primarily with the brain and involve processing information in some form or another. Manual tasks are, of course, primarily using the hands and involve making things happen physically in the world. Now, obviously, every task is a mix of these. You must type or communicate in some way if you do a cognitive task, and you must think about what you are doing with your hands. So the division is not stark, but it exists. The other distinction that we often make is between routine and non-routine tasks, and this turns out to be an important distinction. So a routine task is one that can be described by a recipe or a list of steps that one must take. A non-routine task is one that requires judgment and improvisation. So one of the things that technology does is it changes the task mix of a job. It changes the demand for different tasks. It changes the productivity of workers in different tasks. It does all of this in various ways. So typically, if we think about these two distinctions, routine and non-routine, cognitive and manual, labor economists have found that there's kind of a hierarchy in terms of wages and a hierarchy in terms of occupations. So the highest paid occupations focus primarily on non-routine cognitive tasks. Some of the stuff that Rogayeh was talking about, making decisions, problem solving, figuring out the right question. So these tend to be associated with the professional, managerial, and technical occupations, which are the highest wage, highest credentialed occupations, generally speaking. Non-routine tasks are not only high-end fancy tasks, there are also a lot of non-routine manual tasks. These include things like driving, cleaning, home healthcare work, various personal services. These are tend to be the lowest paid occupations. In the middle, requiring both sort of middle levels of skill and paying middle compensation, are routine cognitive especially, but also some routine, non-routine manual tasks. So this includes things like information gathering, assembly, standard office work, production, all those kind of things. So this is a graph from some work by David Autor and a co-author about the task composition of the US labor market. Now, a lot of the examples that I'm going to do are from the US, but similar trends apply to Canada. So one of the things we see with the expansion in information and communication technology since the early 1970s is that there has been a decline in the demand in the usage of routine tasks. And the reason is that information and communications technology allows us to automate either just through a computer or maybe with the assistance of physical objects, allows us to automate routine tasks that were previously accomplished by a person. And so A lot of the simple office work, if you're work in an office, you've seen this. A lot of the simple office work that 40 years ago was done by administrative assistants is now done by computers. A lot of the record keeping, a lot of the information gathering is now done not by a person. Non-routine tasks by their very nature are much harder to automate. They require judgment, they require improvisation, they require knowledge of the situation. They don't just involve, following a recipe. And so we've seen this fairly rapid growth in non-routine tasks and a fairly rapid decline in routine tasks. So the result of that is polarization, because routine tasks are heavily dominant among the middle skill, middle pay occupations. And so over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen growth at the low end in the personal services category especially, and at the high end in the professional and managerial category. So a lot of the things that people used to do that provided good middle pay, middle class jobs, they're not needed anymore by the workplace. And so this leads to polarization and inequality, and we've observed exactly that. So now that we've talked about the past and present, we may want to know about the future. So will these trends continue? And Rogayeh talked about some of these trends in the context of her own work. And so we definitely want to think about AI and machine learning. And one of the aspects of machine learning and AI that's particularly interesting is that it actually opens the potential of automating some of the more non-routine tasks. The classic example of a machine learning problem is you have 100,000 pictures of dogs and cats, and you want to train a computer to distinguish which ones are pictures of dogs and which ones are pictures of cats. And the way you do that is the data has been constructed so that humans have done this decision, have made this classification, and you train the computer to come up with its own classification recipe. So what you're doing essentially is you're asking a computer to infer a recipe from behavior. The drawback, of course, is that recipe is, as Rogayeh describes it, a black box. The recipe is not a thing that humans necessarily can read. And so what you can do here is, and we see this in various AI applications, is we can mimic human actions. There's inputs. If humans behave in a similar way in response to those inputs, we can track that, we can learn that on a computer, and we can possibly imitate that. And we see this in various settings, computer games, automation in production. We see things like that. Now, that said, one of the drawbacks of this with mimicking human actions is that we mimic human limitations. So people have experimented with using AI to evaluate job applications. Unfortunately, AI will duplicate, without further intervention, will duplicate discrimination that the humans they're modeling engage in. So that's actually a new potential trend, that these technologies that previously duplicated routine tasks, maybe they can duplicate non-routine tasks, and that can change, again, the mix of tasks and skills and change the distribution of income in our society. That's one aspect where the trends may change and where they have actually already started to change. Another aspect of these trends is that COVID-19 and our response and our investment in responding to it may accelerate some of these trends as well. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is one that's on everybody's mind these days, which is location. We're all here on Zoom rather than in a physical location, so we know location matters. So Statistics Canada has done some estimates of this. They actually looked at what people do and how they do it, and they estimate that approximately 40% of Canadian jobs in principle could be done remotely rather than in person. They also, using survey data, estimate that approximately 40% were being done at the height of sort of lockdowns in Canada in late March. And probably 40% will be done remotely over the next little while. Now, a thing about remote work is that these jobs typically involve cognitive tasks. They involve things that can be accomplished by communicating and talking. 40% is less than 60% though. So you may not realize how many more people are not working remotely, because most of us are in jobs that are friendly to remote work. but actually the majority of workers are not in those kind of jobs. Those jobs in the current environment are much more precarious. In some industries, they've gone away. If you're a bartender or a waiter, you have less work than you used to. If you work in the tourism sector, you have less work or no work. For those that do have work, that work often involves more dangerous working conditions. Being a doctor or a nurse or a school teacher or a meat packer or a fruit picker, those are all more dangerous jobs than they used to be. Now, notice that these are jobs that typically involve manual tasks, and these are exactly the folks that have seen, not great labor markets over the last, 40 years. And so COVID has the unfortunate characteristic that it is tend to exacerbate existing unfortunate trends. So we might ask about what happens in the future. Everybody talks about this all the time, so I'll just throw out a few economic thoughts on how many of us will be going back to the office when this is all over. Based on what we know from remote learning, where we're actually able to, give students tests and measure how they're doing, remote learning is not, by the current evidence, as nearly as effective as in-person learning. Now, that's limited evidence based on a very short sample, and in some cases, what happened in the spring, which was kind of a improvised, jury-rigged mess. But what we know so far about remote learning is that it's not great. And in particular, it's okay for students with other resources, students with good internet connections, and people, with younger children, families that can support their learning. And it's much worse for students that don't have that. And so again, the current situation is exacerbating existing inequalities. So will we go back? Well, there's a couple of reasons that we should go back and a couple of reasons that we shouldn't. One of the things that has jumped out at us teaching at a university, and I see the same thing from people who are running offices, is that monitoring of work done by others has become really costly and in some cases really ineffective. It's very hard to keep students from cheating on exams. It's a lot of work to do that. It's a lot of work to make sure that your employees are actually working. Because under normal environment, people show up at 9 and they leave at 5, and they're probably working most of that time. If you're not checking on employees regularly, you don't know what they're doing. And that's a problem for some students and for some workers. Another thing that I touched on earlier is that there's a unequal and difficult distribution of complementary inputs. People don't necessarily have access to the resources they need to work at home. In terms of a regional matter, there are a lot of parts of Canada that have very poor quality internet service. They cannot work remotely the same way that some of us in bigger cities can. And finally, humans have social needs. And this is actually not unrelated to monitoring. Humans need to talk to each other. They need to see each other. I've heard many tales from people who are managers of workers who, struggle with the lack of social contact. And so that has big implications for productivity. That said, there are reasons not to go back, or the reasons not to return to business as usual. We've all made a lot of investments in remote activities, and there's a lot of network externalities. Now that all of us need to know how to use Zoom, it's hard to imagine that we won't continue to use Zoom even after we've returned to working in person. There's huge network externalities here. People value flexibility and are willing to take less money for flexibility. They may be interested in working at a distance, living in a different place from where they work. The long-term implications of this are pretty straightforward. If there's a lot more working from home, if there's a lot more remote work, there'll be less demand for office space and the associated services and goods. There'll be more demand for connectivity and the associated services and goods. There's a real question about whether right now, a lot of people work in places like New York and the Bay Area and Vancouver that are very expensive to live in. There are a lot of people who would prefer to make New York money and live far, far away from New York. And so there may be some amount of movement out of expensive cities, which may affect those real estate markets that have been so costly in recent years. There may be less business travel as people are more comfortable having remote meetings, or there may be more if a lot of people move away from their main place of work and have to visit the office every few weeks. So we don't know. Excuse me. So now I wanted, before we get onto policy, I wanted to point out that one aspect that is underappreciated, I think, at the moment, is that markets have changed quite a bit. There's a lot of evidence, recent evidence, and it's not definitive, but it exists, that leading firms have a lot of market power in the current economy, and that their owners and management are getting big monopoly rents. There's also some evidence in labor economics that monopsony, the market power of employers, is higher than it used to be. So neither of these things is necessarily unique to the information age, but the rents seem to be larger than they were for, say, General Motors. And what's different now is that these rents used to be split with a unionized workforce. So if a company is making giant piles of money and has a unionized workforce, the unionized workforce can take a share of that. Most information economy companies do not have a large unionized workforce. One of the things that we see in many places is a decline in labor share of income. And these seem to be related observations. All right, so last set of things I want to talk about, because I'm running out of time, is that none of these consequences, all these trends are just the way things are, but the consequences are not a thing that is out of our control. Policy is going to matter. So this is a graph of hourly earnings of low-skilled workers in a bunch of different nations. The US is in pink. Canada is about 5 to the right of the US. So one of the things that we can see in this graph is that low-skilled workers do not have the same earnings in all countries. They do much better in some countries than in others, especially sort of Northern European countries. So it is possible for low-skilled workers to earn high wages. Now, you might think, well, the advantage of low-skilled workers earning low wages is innovation, employment, mobility. But one of the things that we see is inequality is not particularly closely related to employment. So it's not the case that less equal countries have stronger work incentives, and so people are more likely to be employed. It's also not the case that less equal countries experience greater economic mobility. In fact, it's the opposite. Less equal countries tend to experience lower mobility. One thing that we do see is that greater inequality is associated with weaker unions. So unionization is much lower in more unequal industrialized countries. So in terms of policies, in terms of a policy response to the trends that we see, there has been in economics a lot more openness to certain policy interventions that have been around for years that enhance worker bargaining power. I wouldn't say that there's an overall consensus. Everybody thinks that these are things that we should have more of, but I would say that the consensus has shifted in this direction. So things that enhance worker bargaining power include higher minimum wages, include steps to encourage private sector unionization, things like that. They also argue in favor of provide some evidence in favor of strengthening the social safety net. We've actually seen this in the COVID-19 environment. Countries all over the world have provided income supports in response to the shock to markets that COVID-19 represents. Quite a few people have used this to argue and used the idea of AI replacing all of us and the elimination of work to argue for something a little more fundamental, which is a universal basic income or guaranteed annual income or various variations on that. And those were things to think about. The last thing I wanted to mention is a large fraction of what I've showed you, especially the graphs, are from, and I can steal because I'm an academic and I've cited, are from a paper by the MIT Work of the Future Task Force, which came out this year, fairly recently. This is a group of famous economists, famous business faculty, famous technology people all working together to write about the work of the future and tell us more about the work of the future. So if you're interested in this topic, guys, I really suggest that you find that paper and take a look at it. It's written for a general audience, not a purely academic audience. I am done. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, Rogayeh. I'm going to do a physical clap so you can actually see me. Yeah, that was excellent. So at this point, we have our Q&A. I was just speaking with Carmen, and before I go on, I want to mention that Carmen Chin is our communications officer who's running the back end of this. So I want to make sure we recognize all the hard work that she's been doing during this presentation. We were just discussing whether we should have big chat questions or actually allow you guys to unmute your mics. I think it'd be a great idea just to unmute your mics because some of your questions are a bit detailed. So I don't know if Dave Friedman, if you want to unmute your mic and ask the first question, I would love it if you did.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry for my bad video. Actually, do you mind if I ask a different one? So I read this, the book, what was it called? Prediction Machines by a bunch of UAT faculty. And their argument was, look, like computers were just made it really easy to add up numbers. And AI makes it really, is this new technological advance that means that we're better at predicting stuff. And, when it was easy to add up numbers, then we kind of learned how to make a lot of different things that don't seem like adding up number tasks into adding up number tasks. And then the question is, okay, well, what's basically a prediction task, but that, I don't realize is a prediction task? That strikes me as like the area in terms of where's the labor market going to go? How is AI going to change the world that I really don't have a handle on? And so while you're here discussing this, I'd love to hear answers both from Rogayeh and from Brian.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. I'm happy to jump in. One of the things that I'm seeing is actually not really, like, to your point, what the algorithms are, the prediction mechanisms that we have. Like, in all honesty, majority of the organization that at least I have been dealing with, they don't really need to go way beyond regressions. And sure, there are more sophisticated things we can do, and it's actually quite interesting to do that. But in all honesty, that really isn't a problem. The big problem is how are they actually even going to use it? The level of literacy inside the organization is so low. I mean, even some of the major banks, some of the biggest organizations said, hey, you'll be surprised. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's filled with some really brilliant people, but when it comes to trickling the information up or down, there's a lot of silos. So what ends up happening is actually severalfold. One is there's all the data in the world. I remember last year I was talking with the Chief Customer Experience Officer at JPMC, and this is literally a statement from him. We know everything about customers and we know nothing about our customers. And so, they were like, hey, is it really good enough for me to say, hey, I don't know what my customers' intentions are, where I see every single transactional activity that exists, and we have been logging that for so many years, right? So the thing is, the questions exist. Then they're like, okay, what are we going to do with the data? Oftentimes data sitting in a lot of different silos. I know I'm saying the trivial thing of data not talking to each other, and somebody in one department doesn't even have access to somebody else's data sets, etc. So that's typical, and that's across the board. But then again, the question is that again enough to stop us? The whole mentality of like, I need to have all the data, and all the data needs to be very clean and very beautiful before I can do anything. That's really flawed to begin with, because what you need to do is, again, follow the scientific methodology. Ask a question, build a small model, go test it. If it works, make it a little bit more sophisticated, make it bigger, and take it from there. That way of thinking about how things can potentially slowly scale up is very slowly entering enterprise. And that to me was one of the bigger shocks. Like, I would sit and I would start talking about like these sophisticated things, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's not really what these guys need.
If you don't mind my sort of response, I mean, almost like what I'm getting out of your response here is that, like, wow, just like the stuff that looks like it seems almost obviously a prediction task, like that stuff is way harder than I'm probably giving it credit for. And so in terms of what do I not, in terms of the question I'm asking, it seems like for forecasting like the next 10 years, I'm asking the wrong question. It's more of like, maybe this is a 50-year question. So,
Let me give a very quick example in that, and then I'm going to stop talking and let Brian also jump in. Like one of the things, this happened last January. We were working with this organization. They are wealth management out of New York. They manage about $250 million. And one of the questions that they had was that we have a lot of different financial products. They're a wholesaler. So imagine different kind of strategies that they have, and they sell it to firms such as Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo and on and on. So, but what the problem that they were dealing with was that they have these products that they call category killers. What that means is that this particular organization is known for 2 or 3 of their products in the market. But they also know that they have a whole bunch of other products that actually work. They're really competitive products, but they had no way of figuring out how they can actually position their products in the market. So then, and the funny thing is that they're buying about $100,000 a month worth of data. So they know everything about everything. Like they know who is in the market for exactly what. But the way they were approaching the problem was that, oh, I know Dave bought his bananas from me. Can I predict how many more bananas Dave is going to buy from me tomorrow? Well, sure, but that's only going to take you so far because the odds are Dave is also buying apples and oranges. So don't you want to know what is the general thing that he's in the market for? Because frankly, you have data for it, and then be able to position that in the market. So the algorithm that we built for them exactly would do that. So it would predict per individual, per firm, per zip code, what are these individuals are in the market for, and then we would look at the trends and macro trends and did a whole bunch of like fun stuff with it. But then here was the problem. The problem wasn't even taking it to deployment or scaling it. The problem was their salespeople. These are Wall Street people, and how on earth are they even going to trust that what comes out of quote unquote a black box is going to work? I remember actually at that point I was even talking with Luba, and I was like, here's the thing, we really have to design an experiment for them. And again, hence the role of an economist in that thing, because if you actually put the evidence and show them that. So anyway, the point of the story, the moral is that there are other things that are usually bigger blockers than the sense of not having access to predictive analytics.
Just to add to that, right? I mean, we often make a distinction that you make, I'm sure, between prediction within sample and counterfactual prediction, right? And so one of the things that does require human intervention is figuring out ways to infer counterfactual predictions. So that's an area where there's a lot of room for human activity. And I would say, right, I mean, this kind of relates to what I was saying earlier about AI has the potential to make non-routine tasks into routine tasks. To the extent that those non-routine tasks actually are routine, we just don't know what the routine is. So AI can learn from watching us if what we do is actually predictable, and the predictability is the useful part of what we do. So that was all I had to say on that.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dave, for the question. I'm going to ask Matt. Matt, did you want to unmute and ask your question as well, or would you like me to read it? It's up to you. If Matt's still here. Matt, I'm going to ask your question then, okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Sorry, I'm unmuted. Matt just stated, Rogayeh, you stated that the brain drain is stifling entrepreneurship. This is actually a good question. Could you expand on that, please? Second, you mentioned natural language processing or something to that effect. What does that mean, and why is it of interest in machine learning and AI?
One of the trends that I see, a little bit anecdotally, but I think it's a little bit of a broader trend that we are starting to notice. So there is a lot of hype around AI right now, and there is a lot of. I remember some of my friends from Stanford, they had just finished their postdocs, and they're like, "Oh, we're just going to start this company, and we're going to raise money and stuff like that." So there is a little bit of a funny gap transitioning from academia to quote unquote real world. And the honest truth of it is that not much in our academic journey actually prepares us for that transition. And I think that's the piece that we can do better. We can do, people like me who now have a little bit more experience in the industry, I actually can come back and be like, hey guys, let's think about this and that kind of questions, or how we can address that within the academia. Because not only I understand, and I went through that journey, but I actually also really love it. And I find a lot of value in what academics do and how that can translate into real world and benefit it. But I think that gap is I have a lot of friends that are working for Amazon right now, for example, extremely dissatisfied. And they're not, it's really hard for them to make that transition. So am I exactly answering the question around entrepreneurship? I don't think so. But what I am seeing is that there's a lot of failed stories. The failure stories that I see is more than the non-failure stories that I see. But I think there is a way of actually transitioning and cross-pollinating across industry and academia better. I truly believe that that is possible. In terms of NLP and how it actually relates. So, I mean, the algorithms that are being used, so under natural language processing, so they come, it's basically a study of or applying a whole bunch of different algorithms to uncover patterns when it comes to words and languages, etc. So how we end up using it is some of these algorithms are, okay, let's think about this example. So when you have a sentence, so in a sentence, the order of words matter. And so, the whole, some of the more sophisticated algorithms is trying to tell you, okay, you take the order of the words and you're supposed to predict what is, for example, the next word coming after at the end of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence. So there is something about not just the words individually by themselves, but also the order. So in an economist language, it's the time series as well as the cross-sectional component when it comes to data. What ends up happening in most of, for example, recommendation systems that we see, you go to Amazon, you are clicking on a product and then something else pops up. It's like people who bought this also bought these other things. So that's an example of a recommendation system. Most of these recommendation systems are built just considering the cross-sectional dimension of the data, meaning that Rogayeh did X, Y, and Z, and as I end up purchasing a bunch of other things, and you're just like looking at a lot of data across a whole bunch of different individuals, and then saying, hey, people who bought this bag end up buying this shoe. Well, what ends up happening in these algorithms is that they actually miss the time series dimension because it's just hard. It's hard to combine those things. So that's why now a class of these algorithms from NLP are moving actually more to predicting individual behaviors and moving into that. So that class is called transformers. That's one of them. It uses something called attention layer. It's quite fascinating actually. But basically it's a way of going beyond Markov models and combining the models that consider the time series as well as cross-sectional dimension.
Matt, I hope that answers your question. We have a couple of hands raised. Brendan, I was going to start off with you if you wanted to just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I had a couple of questions, but one to start for Rogayeh. How do you help companies steer, how do you steer the conversation with companies and get them to ask better questions? Because I imagine a lot of what you have to deal with is these executives coming to you with bad questions or assumptions that they made ahead of time. And I imagine that you have to kind of wade through that and navigate that and peel back and figure out what is the root of the business problem that they're trying to solve. So I was hoping you could explain how you navigate those conversations.
Thanks, Brandon, for that. That's actually a really good question. Well, short answer with difficulty, a little bit longer answer. You have to really listen to them because, in all honesty, I think it's a two-directional problem. When they sit with, most of the companies we work with, at least, they have their own data science teams. These are Walmarts of the world that they have like Walmart labs or, like there hasn't been a single organization we've worked with so far that don't have actually rather big data science teams. But why they end up working with a group like us is because when we sit with the executives, there is this element of really listening to just uncover. And there's also another thing, it's about having what I call irrelevant people in the room. what ends up happening, I touched a little bit on the silos that exist in these companies. They, I guess, intuitively know that their problem is not just their problem, but somehow they believe it's just their problem. And so when we start our engagement and work with these different companies, I insist. Sometimes I just put my foot down and I'm like, who else is going to be interested in this dialogue? Oh, so-and-so from this whatever group. Oh, can we have a conversation with them? When we started working with, because I just said it with Walmart, our sponsor, for example, was Chief Product Officer. And but we ended up working directly with the design team, with the head of design, with the CTO's team from like Walmart Labs, stuff like that. And they all come from, they all approach the same problem from a lot of different angles. And but they usually don't know how to speak to each other, as in technical people are very much in this thing of, oh, here's an algorithm, here's a solution, here's this and that. But then, people in design that have done a lot of qualitative research, they actually potentially have better grasp of what the problem is. They don't quite understand this other group. So, for me, one of the big things was I do understand concepts behind behavioral economics. I have studied game theory. I do understand, other, I guess, fundamentals of thinking about how, I guess, what economists think and how they, it can actually, just that whole process, right? So I think it's been a long and hard practice of like really listening deeply to them. And I myself, I cannot afford to make many assumptions. I have to really listen to them. And I think with the executives, the moment they hear the right question, they also get it. It's actually not that difficult. When you retell them, it's, oh, this is what I'm hearing from you. This is what I heard from 5 other people. Am I actually hearing you correctly? And so there's a lot of power in that.
Thanks for that. Brendan, good to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you in a long time, so nice and good question. Mishi, you've got a question. I haven't seen you in a while either, so
yeah,
do you want to meet yourself?
Great presentations all around, guys. I'm going to backtrack a little bit around what you and Rogayeh, you and Brian were talking about, automating tasks and how companies right now, they're buying all this data. They have all this data. They're doing a lot of planning, but it sounded like they're not taking action. And I'm wondering whether the way the tech industry is evolving plays a role in that. Like, I recently joined SaaS, and there's a solution for everything. We're using AI to automate everything, right? And it's crazy, the software for everything. So what I understood was, it kind of sounds like maybe the SaaS industry is preventing marketing teams or just other teams to really act on their ideas and all this data that they already have. Is that fair to assume?
Brian, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to go?
I mean, I'll make one comment, right? In any organization, so I have a dual role as an academic and as an administrator. In any organization, information tends to be generated and then continue to be generated beyond the point where it needs to be generated, where it's producing action.
Right.
So I mean, I think that's always a problem, and something that leadership has to always pay attention to. What steps are we producing and maintaining information that we're not actually taking action on? But that sometimes requires some hard decisions.
Okay, thank you.
I can't agree more with Brian. I was gonna say that I guess like an iteration of what Brian said. To your point, no shortage of data. But let me tell you a story. This is again during COVID. We just started working with this organization, and the question, there was actually really quite a few different interesting questions. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but what their internal team had done, they were working with a software, and actually it was very much around AI and predictive. So they had XGBoost built in there. There was a whole bunch of different algorithms that already was in there, and all you needed to do was just point and click, frankly. And so what the team had done had literally taken the entire data set, like it was just like all the variables in a data set, and just fed it to that model. And they were presenting this. I was sitting in this presentation and I just couldn't believe my eyes. They were presenting the result, and they were going on and how one of the very predictive variables out of this is user ID, the randomly generated number. Was like, I just accepted it. I was like, oh God, what am I getting into? But like, this is literally it. So to your point, no shortage of solutions. but do we even know how to use the solutions? And this
Right.
is what I'm really, it scares me, frankly, when I look at the state of the industry. There's a lot of hype, as I talked about, and a lot of people are like, right now, whoever knows whatever kind of coding, it's just like their title is going to be a data scientist. And it is scary, and it's going to have unintended consequences for all of us, because the minimum you can do is actually just like think about what you are putting into your models. Brian touched on this, right? There is limitations to AI. It's only as powerful as data that you are feeding it, and it's only as good as predicting based on what it saw before. So if there is something happens, such a shock to economy, COVID, or whatever else that it hasn't seen and dramatically changes the patterns, that model is obsolete.
Right. Totally.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Good question, Mishi. We have a few other questions. I was hoping that I could just pop in for a second and ask both you and Brian a question. One is, I'm looking at our participant list, and we have a wide variety of alumni here. And I want to call you students because it seems like yesterday. But they're in banking, they're in tech, they're in private industry, retail. I mean, there's a whole slew. Some are looking for work. A question that I often get from alum is they want to make sure that they're positioning themselves in an area that's not obsolete. And sometimes when you're in an industry, you find yourself becoming redundant and not even knowing it. And of course, COVID happened, and a lot of other things. A lot of people found themselves out of work. But is there an area or some advice that maybe both of you have that we can make sure that our alum and people who are out there are well positioned to make sure that they stay employed and in this market? Rogayeh, Brian.
Brian, do you want to go first? Am I going to take the bullet?
Well, I mean, I would say it is very unlikely that problem-solving skills and communication skills will not be critical for the foreseeable future. So whatever builds those skills is usable in the workplace, right? Using AI in the way that Rogayeh's firm does not necessarily, it involves having that problem-solving ability in general. It does not necessarily involve solving problems that were well known 20 years ago. But all that stuff is transferable.
The thing that I would add to that, and maybe in this I answer the question that Alex has formed. Alex is my advisor, so I'm biased. I'm going to answer his question in here too. The question that Alex is also asking, I think, very much related to this, because when I think about my own transition, which frankly was rather a painful transition, it took me quite some time to really figure out how to even translate myself. I was a kid in a candy store in most of the places that I was in, as in I had access to data, but I didn't quite have a way of relating it to either the things that really mattered for those organizations. And in that, I couldn't really bring the true value of what I had to offer to these organizations, right? So, the thing that helped me in that transition was a little bit of patience and real curiosity. It's easy for us coming from academia sometimes, especially when you've done a master's or you've done a PhD, to be like, okay, and you're seen as an expert, right? So, when people come to you with questions, and so, but they are not necessarily open to hearing all the opinions that you have and all different things that you bring to the table, because oftentimes it requires them changing the way they are doing things. It relates to the question that Brandon was also asking, right? So, by definition, the kind of work that we do sits at a place of innovation and things. It's just a different way of looking at things. So I think there is a level of patience that is required from us, and also a curiosity to truly understand the market also. Just tying this a little bit to the entrepreneurship question as well, I think it's a little bit of a flawed assumption for us to think, oh, because we have a PhD or we have come from like a strong academic background, we actually understand the market and we understand the problems that are out there, specifically like this. There is a lot of nuances in this space. So I think being patient and doubling down on things that actually really differentiate us, such as exactly the point that Brian made. There is a way that economists, for example, think that is really not common, and being able to just maximize those and also learn from industry.
I think I'm going to add, and thank you very much for that, both of you. I'm going to also add, I mean, we are an econ community here, and we have a very strong LinkedIn presence, and I'm sure most of you are part of it. And if you're not, please join our LinkedIn group. I think we're almost 1,200 people strong. Networking, of course, is a huge part of it. This is a huge networking opportunity as well. So if you want to connect with somebody and you're shy, you can connect through me, just letting everyone know. This sort of leads to another question here for both of you. And Aaron, do you want to ask the question, or should I ask for you? It's a good question, actually. It's for his quarantine time reading. Maybe I'll ask for you, Aaron. A more basic and general question: any other recommendations to add to my reading list with my newfound quarantine time? An MIT paper was mentioned. Any other papers, books, etc., that are particularly eye-opening, thought-provoking, or educational and practical? Any leaders in industry or academia we should look to follow and learn about? So any quick recommendations?
The book actually David mentioned is a really good one. There is another book, a book related to the topic. It's called Weapons of Mass Destruction. So mass as in M-A-T-H, Weapons of Mass Destruction. That's a fascinating read. If you guys haven't picked up Surveillance Capitalism, that's a really interesting one. I'm reading a book right now. It's called Hidden Habits of Genius, and that is just brilliant read. There are researchers coming out of MIT, and just I in order to stay on top of the industry, what I usually do is that I read Economist and Wall Street Journal and Fortune just almost religiously. So those are the things that I just do in order to stay on top of the industry.
The other thing that I'd suggest is there are a lot of websites, and there are a fair number of books that will step you through the basics of a classification tree and some machine learning methods. And you can totally just take those for a spin and try them out. That's not, if you know a little, if you're able to handle R or any other computer language that's used for statistical analysis, and even if you aren't, it's not that hard to try out and play around with it.
Coursera,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Rogayeh.
Coursera offers a whole bunch of different really interesting AI course as well. And to add to what Brian's talking about the programming languages, if you don't know how to do Python, learn Python, especially if you have any interest in this field, like really getting into data science and getting into AI, because that's just becoming more and more the language.
We're almost done here, but Brendan had his hand up quickly. Did you want to just say something, Brendan?
Yeah, this one can be a quick question for Brian. You mentioned in the past unionization accompanying markets where these companies were making big rents. Is that something you see coming for technology?
It's going to be tough, right? One of the things that these companies have that General Motors didn't have is that they can do all sorts of things all over the place, and they can have, separate workforces for different aspects of their work. There is not this, classic industrial setting in North America, at least, where there's a place that a large number of roughly homogeneous workers come to. So unionization for those kind of places is going to be quite tough. And so we do have to think about more creative ways to get money into the hands of workers, and get those rents shared with the wider economy. Because, right, if you look at the relationship, especially in the U.S., but even in Canada, if you look at the relationship between productivity and wages, until the 70s, they moved together. Since then, wage growth, especially median wage growth, has fallen way short of productivity growth. So we have to figure out some ways of getting workers more bargaining power in general. Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon.
That we see is a lot of very special, like Brian, you touched on it earlier as well, the digital divide. that is happening right now. A lot of specialized skills are really ending up in a very few very big companies. And so that's another trend that is going to be interesting. Right now, even some of the biggest banks, when their data science team is around 10, 20 people, it's considered a very large team of data science. So whereas, Google's and Amazon's are literally built and they are native. And everybody wants to be like an Amazon, everybody wants to be native to these organizations, but it's just like such a big divide in terms of those sort of like very specialized skills.
And
sorry, go ahead, Mike.
yeah, to add to that, right? We've had the experience right around when Rogayeh was finished her PhD. A couple of her cohort had pursued some data science work, and without going into details, found that the last thing you want to do is be the only data scientist in a small shop. That is a bad job to have. So right, there is definitely with a bunch of these things, and you see this actually with robotics as well. There's really a big gap between the largest scale users of these technologies and everybody else. Very few medium and small firms have any kind of serious robotics. Very few of them have any kind of serious data science. It's all the big companies and consulting firms.
Thanks very much. If you look at your feed, everyone, the chat, I think Wayne and David Freeman have some other articles and books that you may want to look at to pass the time, and they look like great articles. We're really coming to the end of our time, and I just wanted to mention a few things. One is I wanted to thank everyone. I want to thank Rogayeh and Brian. These are fantastic sort of added value presentations that you gave us. So everyone, if you can give them a nice round of applause virtually, that would be fantastic. I also wanted to mention that you must join our LinkedIn group if you haven't already. I mean, it's the only way that I can stay in touch with many of you, and on that, there's many of you I recognize here, and I want to thank you for joining us, because I do once in a while stay in touch with as a department, we stay in touch with you. So if you have ideas for more alumni events, and we didn't know how this one was going to go, we just knew that we wanted to get everyone together. It was tough to do this sort of physically, obviously because of COVID, but we wanted to get some econ related content, and again, Brian and Rogayeh, you did that so well. Also, for everyone that's in attendance today, we do have this random raffle draw that we're going to, that Advancement's going to do, and so they're going to get in touch with whoever the winner is. So I look forward to some great prizes. And finally, there was a purpose for this event as well. We did want to introduce the Economic Student Leadership Fund. And that's something that we're going to be promoting throughout the year. I'm especially passionate about that fund just because, it's there to service all students, undergrads, grads, and PhD students, to hopefully get them out networking and get them funded for really sort of proactive student, learning events and engaged, not just within the university, but throughout the university and all over the business world. But at this point, I think we're going to end it off and wish everyone a good night. Go and eat dinner or whatever it is you have to do. Everyone, thank you very much for attending, and look forward to more events next year. You know me. If you guys know me, I'm going to be bugging you for stuff anyway. So I look forward to talking to all of you soon. Take care, everyone.